I'm Mark Cowan, Director of the California Department of Water Resources, and I'm joined today by Karen Ross, Secretary of the California Department of Food and Agriculture, Dr. Jerry Merrill, Deputy Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency, and Chuck Bonham, Director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I believe on the phone we've got Mike Connor, Commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. So we'll make a few introductory comments and then open it up for your questions. We're here today to mark an important milestone. After 7 years of intensive planning and collaboration, we're now ready to begin the rollout of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and to begin to engage the public on the details of that plan. Our goal is to continue to be as transparent as we can while we continue to refine and finalize the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. The plan is lengthy and complicated, and we want to provide enough time for the interested public to review it. And with that in mind, we intend to roll out the chapters of the plan in 3 stages. We're doing that first set of chapters today. Please keep in mind that this is a preliminary draft. We're offering this now so the public can begin to digest the information and the details of the plan while we continue to evaluate and refine the plan, working with the state and federal agencies that are engaged with us. Today we're releasing the first 4 chapters of the plan. Those chapters give an overview of what the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is, describes the current ecological conditions in the Delta, describes the plan's 22 separate conservation measures, which are really the guts of the plan itself, including the construction, operation, and maintenance of a new water diversion facility in the Delta and creation of extensive new wildlife habitat in the Delta. We've scheduled public meetings in Sacramento, West Sacramento next week on March 20th, so people can start to ask questions and get answers about the chapters we've released today. And in the coming weeks, we'll release more chapters of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and hold more public meetings. So to that end, on March 27th, we plan to release 3 more chapters, including one that describes the effects of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan on various listed species. We'll follow that with a public meeting. And then the 5 final chapters, including one that reports on costs and funding sources, is scheduled for release in late April and will also be followed by a public meeting. A lot of details are in your press packets today and also on the BDCP website. As I mentioned earlier, this is an administrative draft of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and a preliminary opportunity for public review. We intend to continue to work with federal and state wildlife agencies to refine some of the details of the plan, leading to a final draft this summer when the official public comment period will begin. Then that final plan will also be subject to comprehensive analysis and review by the federal and state wildlife agencies under the U.S. Endangered Species Act and under California's Natural Community Conservation Planning Act, as well as NEPA and CEQA. So before I pass this on, let me close with this and offer you a personal perspective on what we have here. Based upon some of the previous reports on this topic, I suspect that many of you will describe what we're rolling out today as a new chapter in California's historic water wars. I think that is a very unfortunate narrative. California has struggled with how to deal with the Delta for decades, and meanwhile, the health of the Delta continues to decline, and with it, the water supply reliability that fuels so much of California's economy. After 7 years of very intensive effort, we're now in a position to put forward a responsible, comprehensive plan to reverse those trends. Our plan isn't without controversy. No plan of this magnitude could be. But because of the effort we've put into working through tough issues, this plan enjoys an unprecedented amount of consensus between the federal and state agencies that manage fish and wildlife and the agencies that manage water. This plan isn't about waging war. It's about resolving some of the most critical resource management conflicts in California. With that, I'll ask Commissioner Connor to make some comments. Commissioner Connor, are you on the line?
I am on the line, Mark. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for indulging me participating in the press conference via phone. I'm participating today as a representative of the federal government because we want to make it clear that the federal government has been working closely with the state of California on the BDCP because we agree that the status quo with respect to California's Bay Delta is unsustainable from both an environmental and an economic perspective. The elements of the plan being released today are the result of substantial interaction with federal agencies, and we are very much encouraged by the progress that's been made to date. As Mark indicated, though, collectively we're all evaluating and refining the plan. But the federal agencies are going to continue our partnership with the state with the goal of achieving an overall plan that is legally sufficient, grounded in sound science, appropriately integrated with the federal Central Valley Project, and which overall helps meet the co-equal goals of environmental restoration of the Bay Delta and increased water supply reliability for California. So once again, I appreciate the opportunity to participate, to continue this partnership with the state of California. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chuck Bonham, the Director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm just thankful that Mr. Cowan, the Director of the Department of Water Resources, it looked like he might have almost got ready to say the Department of Fish and Game.
Pulled it off.
As many of you know, we have a new name. I just would start where I typically start with each of you, is to thank you for your continued coverage of this important topic. The news today is that a plan is out. Many have said it would never come out. Some have suggested it couldn't come out. It's out. So our department will be reviewing this plan and then ultimately considering whether to permit it, and will continue to be a regulator around the conservation content in the plan. So I owe a thank you to the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation for substantial changes to the plan you saw at an outline level about a year ago, February 2012. The plan now includes a project that's about 40% smaller, from 15,000 CFS down to 9,000 CFS, from a proposed 5 intakes on the Sacramento River down to 3. And over the last year, we've had a long, responsive dialogue between us and the wildlife community and those in the water supply community at the agency level about our original red flags almost a year ago on that first outline of a project. Hey, don't, kid yourself. We've got way more work ahead of us than is now behind us. And we will quickly move as a department into the role of reviewing this application. But at a framework level, the plan has some solid components. So we're not talking about one species. We're talking about how to better manage 57 species. And it's only 11 of those 57 that are fish. So sadly, we don't see much coverage about the 46 non-fish species in this plan. But let me tell you about a few. Sandhill crane. The plan proposes to restore, protect, and manage almost 16,000 acres of sandhill habitat. Swanson's hawk. The plan proposes to protect and manage about 50,000 acres for the benefit of that species. Giant gardener snake proposes to restore about 16,000 acres for the benefit of that species. Next component that makes sense, higher standards. We're not talking about incremental change. We're talking about legal standards designed to conserve species and ensure healthy populations across a broad geographic range. I like that standard. You see that standard expressed in the Natural Community Conservation Plan. I'd encourage you to look at Table 1.2 in the first chapter. It's a checklist of the very precise findings we'll be making against those higher legal standards. Habitat. We're talking about restoration potentially observable from space. Perhaps 100,000 acres of restoration. It once was the most amazing complex of tidal, floodplain, and river habitat potentially in the world. 3% of that exists today. We're talking about 100,000 acres of habitat restoration over 50 years. And in the first 15 years, we want to pursue 30,000 acres of restoration. We're also talking about getting off the South Delta. Y'all have heard me say before that 2 of every 3 fish that get stuck in the South Delta die by being sucked into the South Delta pumps. It doesn't get better when you think about migration for salmon through the system. About 95% of our San Joaquin River juvenile Chinook don't make it through the Delta in their migration. That figure on the Sacramento side for Chinook is about 60% mortality rate. We're talking about more modern screening. So when you move the diversion from the South Delta up to the Sacramento River, you will have the first chance to screen a diversion based on current technology. Screening alone doesn't fix this problem, though. You may hear some folks tell you, keep the pumps where they are and just screen them. Well, the fundamental problem is the presence and absence of the fish in the South Delta, not the actual screens of any diversions. This change of diversion point fixes that problem. We're talking about water year types. 5 water year types monthly and management of water based on those water year types. That's just good common sense. We're talking about 20-something conservation measures, many of which aren't about water. I'd ask you to read CM6, channel margin enhancement, CM12, methyl mercury management, CM meaning conservation measure 21, non-project diversion strategies, CM measure 15, localized reduction of predator fishes. It goes on. And on top of that content, we're going to overlay a science project program and an adaptive management regime. So we're going to have to, at our department, look through a lot of information and reserve our ability to make these permitting decisions, but the framework is one to be welcomed. Hey, the Ninth Circuit famously once wrote, "Water litigation is a weed that flowers in the arid West." That's been the truth in the Delta. We can do better. It's not going to be easy. You know, don't kid yourself. People will make this ad hominem. And they may come after me personally or Mr. Cowan or the rest of us individually. They'll certainly come after the state collectively. But doing nothing's no longer an option. This is the native home of hope, according to Wallace Stegner. We got to do this. And I just encourage you to ask all of your readers to give us the space to engage in the public debate about fixing the problems in the Delta. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. I got to get a hold of your book of quotes. So let's start with questions in the room, if we could. Any questions in the room?
I'll have a question in the room. While there are a number of parts of what we're talking here, I want to ask a couple of questions about the tunnel project in particular, because you start to kind of lay out a specific path for it, a construction timetable in some sense, you know, about the intake facilities and everything else. There still is this question, as you know, about how much water we're actually talking about through that. They're designed for 9,000 cubic feet a second. There's been some sense, at least when the governor talked about this last summer, that there could be a variation there, that it may not be 9,000. At what point do you decide what the maximum is there? And as a follow-up to that, given that we're talking about water users paying for this, do they get some guarantee of how much they get before they hand over the money?
Very good question. And if you don't mind, I'm going to try to go into a little detail, so hang with me.
All right.
First of all, this plan does not include any guarantees for water supply deliveries. Second of all, whatever deliveries take place will be consistent with progress towards over 200 biological goals and objectives for the plan, and consistent with water rights of all other water right holders in the Central Valley system. As far as the plan goes itself and what it means to water supply deliveries, one of the great points of new flexibility that this plan provides is by adding those North Delta diversion points, we get a whole lot more opportunity to opportunistically operate the system such that we can move water when fish are not in danger. A great example of that this year, you're probably all familiar with the circumstance that played out in December and January of this year. Our existing biological opinions that control operations of both the state and federal projects include criteria that requires us to limit reverse flows in the Delta. And we've got a chart over here that describes what those reverse flows are. Essentially, we've got pumps in the south part of the Delta right now. When we operate them at high capacity, we tend to pull water towards the southern part of the Delta. And as Director Bonham points out, That's not good for fish. So our existing biological opinions require us to limit the amount of those reverse flows. Because of the presence of Delta smelt this year and also of migrating salmon, we had to reduce deliveries or exports from the Delta on the order of magnitude of about 700,000 acre-feet of water. That's water that if we had those North Delta diversion points in place, we could have moved safely and without harm to fish. As you all know, we've had beautiful weather since February. Unfortunately, that's not good for California's hydrology, and the storm systems have dried up, and it looks like we're headed towards a relatively dry year and low deliveries from both the state and federal projects. We could have avoided a lot of that if this plan was in place. So that inherent flexibility of being able to pull water from the north when it's available follows up on this big gulp, small sip sort of philosophy that you'll hear about. Adds inherent flexibility to whatever else happens in the system. A third big point of, well, let me just back up for a second. The North Delta diversions will be controlled by specific criteria that will be included as permit terms. So we won't be able to operate those just as we please, but rather the amount that can be moved through those facilities will be based upon flow in the river at different times of the year, and different times of wetness of years. Same with the South Delta facilities, just as they're controlled now by regulations that are in the environmental, the ESA biological opinions that control operations. We will continue to have limitations on when we can pull water. In fact, we'll have more conservative limitations so that we do not incur the reverse flows that we've seen under the existing system.
Can I just
Sure.
really quickly, just to try to kind of get to a philosophical thing that you have to deal with going forward, and you had been dealing with for a very long time. There's an inherent amount of distrust about that flexibility of water moving through that system. One side says you're not going to give us enough, the other side says you're going to take out too much. How do you bridge that? What do you do with that?
Well, let me get to that after I finish my long answer. So as you referred to, when the governor and the Secretary of Interior spoke last summer, they spoke about a range of deliveries. What this really gets to is a third set of criteria for operating the projects, and that's how much Delta outflow is going to be required. Now, let me just say this. Regardless of whether or not we move forward on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, we're going to have to address how much outflow is needed for survival of the fish. Under the current approach, that will be based upon how much is needed to avoid extinction of species. Under our plan, we'll be trying to develop outflows that are necessary to allow recovery of species, so a much more progressive standard. What we've done, because of the existing scientific uncertainty about the amount of outflow necessary in order to achieve those biological goals and objectives, in light of the new habitat we'll be creating and in light of all of the other conservation measures we'll be implementing to protect species, it's unclear at this point exactly how much outflow will be necessary. So we've structured a collaborative applied science process that will allow us to experiment, basically, over the next decade to determine just what those requirements ought to be. It comes down to this. If you look at what average deliveries from the state and federal projects have been over the last 20 years, it amounts to about 5.3 million acre-feet of water per year. If we end up on the high outflow end of our decision tree process, total deliveries, annual deliveries could be decreased compared to that 20-year average by about 10%, roughly. If we end up on the lower outflow version of that decision tree, we could end up with deliveries that are about 5% higher than that 20-year average. And those are rough numbers. Ultimately, the Fish and Wildlife agencies will make the determination about what outflow requirements are necessary based upon the outcomes of that applied science process that we're going to conduct. Let me just say this, though, before I ask if Director Bonham wants to add. What's really important here in terms of deliveries that the Bay Delta Conservation Plan might provide is that it shores up our existing water supply reliability. We are seeing a continual decline of covered species in the Delta, and that translates directly into a decline in water supply reliability. We know that if we continue on this track, we'll end up with something much less than 5.3 million acre feet of annual deliveries over the next 20 years. So shoring up that foundational amount of water supply that we receive from both the state and federal projects is really fundamental to California water supply reliability. Chuck, did you want to add something?
I do. So it's a great question. One word, your question is trust. And look, I come to this great opportunity of serving as director of a fantastic department under this governor, having spent about a decade in the conservation community as a water lawyer, struggling sometimes with the essence of your question. How do you know? And one of the things I like that I see in the plan we're receiving today is the commitment to biological goals and objectives. And I want to emphasize this for a moment. So there are about 214 biological goals and objectives. And some of our next work will be determining how you weave those goals and objectives into a permit regime so that all future performance and activity is referenced back to success or failure in achieving those goals and objectives. So at a landscape level, we've got 4 goals. Those are like chemical constituent, physical processes, habitat connectivity goals, and 28 objectives. At the ecological health level, so think abundance, distribution, life cycle history, we have 18 goals and 47 objectives. And then narrowly down at each of the 57 species, we have 45 goals and 90 objectives. And not to put you to sleep, I really encourage you to take a look at some of them. Yeah. Some of them are so specific. We're talking about a winter run juvenile Chinook survival goal and objective of through delta survival increasing by 52% by year 19, or increasing the delta smelt recovery index by a defined percentage. These goals and objectives are specific at a level I don't think we've been talking about in the Delta before. They're measurable, so we'll be able to track failure or success in achieving them. They're actionable. They're not, oh, let's do something good. They're, let's improve the recovery standard by this %. They're time-bounded. They're put it on a schedule. And that's, I think, going forward, what our department will be using as our guidepost for success or failure, and a way in which we're going to ensure meeting our dual goals. So thank you.
Question, I know you're going to be doing the funding part sometime in late April, but I wanted to ask, in the old water bond, there was something like $2.5 billion set aside for in-delta activities.
Right.
Can you do this without a water bond?
We will need some form of state and federal funding to complement the majority of funding that will come from the water users that receive the benefits of the project. We haven't determined exactly what that number is. The water users have committed that they will pay the approximately $14 billion capital cost to construct the facilities. I believe we have a number of something just under $4 billion for the other components of the plan. Some of that, probably the majority of that $4 billion, will be paid by state and federal funding sources. So we will need to identify where those sources come from. A water bond would be a great start.
What is the estimated overall cost, twin tunnels or whatever, conveyance aside, that the exporters have agreed to pay? What's the cost to the public of this project?
Well, again, there's different ways of talking about these numbers. You'll see a number of $23 billion for the total cost of the program that, as I understand it, essentially includes the present value of all the operation and maintenance costs that would be paid over the 50-year life of the plan. In terms of capital costs, I can't give you an exact number, and of course when we get to Chapter 8, the third tranche of chapters we're going to roll out, we'll have a lot more detail to provide. But in terms of capital costs, I would estimate it is certainly something less than the $4 billion that I say is roughly the other measures, because we're going to ask the water users to pay for mitigation costs on top of the capital investment in the water infrastructure. So I would cap the public investment, at least in terms of capital costs, at something less than $4 billion. Again, I think we'll be able to respond to that much more clearly when we roll out that part of the plan.
On the issue of habitat restoration, I'm sort of curious what the balance is there, and I guess broadly how much farmland we're talking about going out of production. I was reading through the chapters and talked about, some species like the garter snake kind of do well in the rice fields. Right. So I don't know, there might be overlap there, whereas orchards, it's not so good for the hawks. They can't see down, can't see the, the prey. So do you have I don't know, can you sort of talk about the divide there?
Wyatt, I don't have a precise acreage figure, but I do think, having worked on restoration around the state for quite some time, it's an important dialogue that agencies engage in with local communities to find the right place to do restoration that's respectful of, rural and working landscapes and the objective of restoring habitat. So I would just point out two examples that excite me about the prospect of habitat restoration. So on the smelt front, right? There's a pretty clear view in the scientific community that possibly if you produce the right kind of habitat, you'll then increase food productivity, which will then translate into more robust and abundant smelt populations. So in those first 15 years, we actually want to test that hypothesis by going out and doing early restoration. And doing it in a way, frankly, which we haven't done yet, which is typically, in my experience, having sought permits to do restoration in my prior life, you get some intra and interagency kind of friction on how to do that timely. So we're going to be committing to restoration in a way which expedites that early work. The other thing exciting to me about restoration is on the salmon front. So you're seeing this some now already in the Yolo bypass area, Nags Ranch. We've had some recent coverage of that in the press. Just on the salmon front, if you can actually reconnect floodplain habitat to river systems on an out-migrating time of the year for salmon, that young fish can hang out in the floodplain and grow larger. And it's pretty clear, these aren't scientific terms I'm getting ready to use, but the science is pretty clear. The fatter they are when they go out in the ocean, the greater chance they come back overall. So that's a very exciting prospect that you see built into, particularly, I think it's CM2, about doing that in the Yolo Basin. We're going to have to do it carefully and in collaboration with our local communities.
Well, to follow up, I mean, we have these numbers on, acreage and things. So at what point will it be determined how that's divided, and will some of that be able to overlap, say, stay rice, production and still count as restoration?
So my answer to your last question is yes. I sure hope we can find that overlap and synergy where we can put the land to work in multiple ways, both ag production or habitat restoration. And Secretary Ross may have some general views on how we can actually find those kind of partnerships in California.
I just wanted to add, just speaking very generally, I think this is a tremendous opportunity for agriculture to engage and really take a look at agricultural stewardship practices, the best practices that have been piloted. The rice industry is a very important example of that, but that's happening throughout agriculture in the state. So it's really important that agriculture engages. This is the time to really take a look at restoration and food production on working landscapes. And so I think it's an opportunity for the community.
Yes.
What specifically is kind of changed in this plan to address the red flag issues? I mean, what's different this time?
Do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure.
Smaller. Spring and fall outflow is a very clear possibility for both longfin and delta smelt. Are two of the most obvious examples that come to my mind, and often the two that are talked about the most as, great concerns in the environmental and conservation community.
I would say that resolution of those red flag issues, to the extent that we have resolved them, and of course that depends upon confirmation as the federal and state wildlife agencies continued review of the plan. But this is one of the most important issues or points of progress that we have to report today. We've got a plan here that I believe will enjoy, as I said earlier, a lot of consensus from all of the agencies that have worked on it, and that's a really important point of progress. It was very difficult to come by, and frankly, we're pretty proud of it. Yes?
My question's about the issue of outflows. You touched on this earlier, and some of the documents you released today talk about the uncertainty surrounding outflows. I guess I'm wondering, is the uncertainty biological or is it financial? Do you need to find a sweet spot where you can divert enough water and still make the project pencil out? Because there's some scientists say that there isn't any uncertainty biologically about outflows.
Right. Well, that's a fair question. As I said earlier, project deliveries will be whatever is consistent with progress towards meeting the biological goals and objectives. So that's a firm statement. Obviously, we want to do that in the most water efficient way we can. So to the extent that we can deliver more water to support California's economy and have substantial progress towards meeting those biological goals and objectives and restoring the Delta ecosystem, that all works in our favor. We're not going to have stable, consistent water supply reliability without a healthy Delta ecosystem. So we're all working towards the same objectives here.
Matt, I've got an additional thought there. So I appreciate the question. I don't think there's any dispute, and I can confirm there's none in my mind, to the extent I have the Stephen Colbert, formidable debate, and I argue with myself. I don't have any confusion. Fish need enough water of the right quality at the right time of years, period. And I think this plan reflects that concept, where there's still remaining discussion, just precisely how much and when. And you see that reflected in the decision trees. And we know that looking at some of the longfin work being done, perhaps not yet published, or Delta smelt work already published, that there's some potential pivot points where with that amount of CFS you may see this response, or not enough CFS you may see that response. And I believe our science program and decision tree will help us tease out those remaining unresolved issues in the coming days or months.
Will you just real quick look at timeline, not the timeline on the release of the documents, but on the overall project, and whether you could get started on the tunnels in theory before the water bond election if everything speeds forward? Because you need the money from the water bond to pay for some of the habitat stuff, but not for the tunnels.
I think it's fair to say that it is not possible to start construction prior to November of 2014. We have a long process to go through to get to permit approval for the Bay Delta Conservation Plan itself. There are a number of other permits, particularly from the Corps of Engineers and the State Water Resources Control Board, that will be necessary after that. So that's not a target of ours.
So when realistically do you see the tunnels and the habitat, getting started?
Right. Well, I'd say this. Right now we're in the process of trying to complete our plan and get it into the hands of the state and federal regulators that need to approve it. They'll have to go through what process they need to go through to approve that, and I can't tell you specifically how long that will take at this point. Our goal is to do that as efficiently as we can, obviously, and move towards securing the other permits we need to move along. Once we have those permits and once we have the approvals necessary, we intended to move forward aggressively on the habitat implementation program. And as I think Chuck noted earlier, we have a target of about 30,000 acres in the first 15 years. That's going to take a Herculean effort to get that done. So that's the first order of priority. Assuming we have the financing we need, assuming we have the approvals we need, then obviously we'll move towards design and construction as well. There's going to be a design period before dirt would actually move. So I would prefer to wait until we roll out the rest of the plan before we try to give you our guess as to what those dates might be for actual construction.
Okay, so no ballparking yet?
And not today. Stuart.
So I know you want questions other than stuff about the tunnel, but I don't think I can help you there. You have a map in your literature showing the kind of general location of the 3 intakes. I'm wondering if those have been set. I mean, this map suggests Clarksburg, Hood, Cortland. Are those locations kind of set in stone yet, or where are you in determining where those would be?
Right. The plan includes fairly specific proposed locations for the 3 intakes. Nothing is set in stone yet. This is an administrative draft plan. As I said earlier, we'll be trying to describe this to the public and educate the public on our proposal over the next few months. This summer, we'll get to an actual proposed plan that will go towards the regulatory process, so nothing's firm until the permits are in hand. But I think you will find fairly specific proposed locations for those intakes within the material that you've seen today.
And where are you in analyzing the potential impact of those intakes on salmon and other fish, and when will that analysis be completed?
Well, a draft analysis is complete and is included in the next tranche of chapters that will roll out in a few weeks. So where you see most of that is in the Chapter 5 effects analysis, and we'll be talking about that shortly. Anything to add?
Do you want to go for a couple?
Sure. Questions on the phone?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask a question via the phone line at this time, please press *1. If you're using speaker equipment today, please lift the handset before making your selection. If you press *1 prior to this message, we ask that you please do so again at this time. And I do have a question from the line of Bettina Boxall with the Los Angeles Times. Please go ahead.
Hello, gentlemen. The 2 big questions that are very much hovering over this plan is the effectiveness of the habitat restoration and how much outflow you're going to need. So it would seem, and it would appear that it's going to take years for those questions to be really answered, which suggests that it is going to be years, and certainly well after construction of the project is initiated, before you really can have a good idea of how much water can be delivered under this system. Isn't that so?
Well, Bettina, as I said before, I think your thesis is correct. We intend to move forward on early habitat implementation as soon as we are able, once permits are granted and financing is secured. So we'll begin to learn as quickly as we can about the effectiveness of habitat. I would just point out that the needed outflow under the Endangered Species Act and the California Endangered Species Act to protect species is an issue for California and for the state and federal water projects, regardless of whether we move on BDCP or not. So we will be wrestling with those issues over the course of the next decade and longer as construction would be taking place. What we're proposing through BDCP is a collaborative process, an enhanced science process with increased resources for conducting that science that will help us get to answers more quickly than we would otherwise. Anything to add to that, Chuck?
Bettina, you can, against what Mark described, begin to see a clearer range, if you will. Remember that Mr. Cowan earlier mentioned if you take the outflow high scenario and export lower, you can kind of see some clarity on one end point, and then if you take the outflow lower, export higher point, you get clarity on that end. So I do believe this set of documents coming out now gives you more specificity, but your overall question, I think Bettina is right. We will need that extra time to find the precise landing spot within that range.
Let me just repeat something I said before as well. If the range that is on the table as part of this proposal is 10% less than over the last 20 years or 5% higher than has occurred over the last 20 years. That's the range that's in play. However, I repeat that turning the trend on the ever-increasing regulations that restrict project deliveries are just as important as any number within that range. And we will expect that without this plan, species will continue to decline and regulations will continue to decrease the flexibility for project operations, and we'll end up with something much less in the future for project deliveries, which would be unacceptable for California's economy.
If I can ask one more question. What are, again, since you don't really know what the outflow requirements are, et cetera, what are you basing that range on?
Well, we do have, well, perhaps I should turn this one to, okay. I'll wear my amateur biologist badge again for this question. We didn't pull these numbers out of thin air. We have two very specific outflow criteria that are included as part of the proposed operations. One, a fall X2 outflow criteria, and another spring outflow criteria that would be implemented to benefit longfin smelt. We have specific analyses that show what the potential benefits of those outflows would be for both of those species. We have perhaps competing hypotheses that with habitat implementation, those outflow requirements might be something less. So that's the basic basis of the range of outflow requirements and resulting water supply deliveries that are on the table right now.
But Tina, one of the just contextual remarks that I think might help you understand some of the challenges I'm personally going through. So there's a relationship, right? It's not completely linear, but at some point, you know, if you took the position all available water is outflow through the gate for, say, pelagic fish, and if you work backwards, particularly upstream through the Sacramento system, what you'll find on the infrastructure side is you begin to hit adversely, say, the cold water pool that's in Shasta, which is very much an asset used by the regulators, wildlife agencies, to ensure at certain times of year we have sufficient cold water coming down the Sacramento for the benefit of salmon. So one of the things we're trying to more precisely define is how much outflow without undercutting the very same kind of commitment to recovery we're pursuing on salmon. So I would offer that just as a piece of information around this balancing between the competing demands of multiple species when it comes to limited water.
And may I ask one more question, if nobody else wants to jump in? In terms of salmon, as you well know, I mean, there's a lot of concern among the commercial salmon community that when you're taking, you know, at some point at least potential, you know, substantial amounts of water out of the Sacramento above the Delta, that really is going to make things worse for migrating salmon, and you know, you'll be basically sort of moving smelt, you know, problems from the smelt in the South Delta to problems for the salmon in the North Delta diversion points. I mean, and I know that you have, you know, I saw that you have criteria for, you know, how much water you're going to take out of the Sacramento, given the flows in the Sacramento. But how really can you address those concerns that, well, maybe you'll make things better for smelt, but you're going to make things worse for salmon going up in Sacramento?
I would offer 3 responses to the question, how will you address those concerns? First, I think in the information you got today, as part of a conservation measure, you'll see proposed bypass flows of up to 15,000 in December and up to, my writing is getting smaller, 17,000 January through June. That's for the purpose of making sure there's enough water in the river as the fish are moving by the screen, therefore the technical term bypass flow. Second,
and forgive me, so when you say bypass, those are talking about river flows.
Correct.
Bypassing the screen.
Correct.
You're not talking about the yellow bypass, et cetera.
Correct.
Okay.
And then second, I would offer this point. You know, these screens will be screened based on 2013 technology and pretty well established screening criteria which didn't exist, decades earlier. So we're going to go through a pretty complicated and rigorous, and there's a whole world of sub-expertise on how you do screening for these kinds of facilities, dialogue, and we will then write those screening criteria into the permit, and the failure to achieve that kind of criteria standard becomes the liability burden of the permittee. So that's my second response. And my third is really more of a comment. I would just say we've got similar sized screens on Glen Calusa and more recently on Red Bluff, and those seem to be working better. So.
Other questions on the phone?
Next question is from the line of Paul Rogers with the San Jose Mercury News. Please go ahead.
Oh, hi. This is from Mark. Mark, as part of the EIR-EIS process, are you planning to study options for restoring the delta and improving water reliability that don't include building any tunnels?
Do you want to take this one? Sorry, inside joke. This plan looks at alternatives for solving delta conveyance issues and for permitting state and federal project operations. So while we continue to look at other actions, including strengthening and maintaining levees, implementing water conservation, water recycling, groundwater management, all those other actions that are necessary to achieve our broader statewide water supply reliability goals. That's not part of this plan. We've spent now 7 years toiling on a plan that deals with delta issues alone. If we attempted to make this a statewide habitat conservation plan, I don't know when we would ever produce a plan.
Are you worried that absent that, you're going to be vulnerable to the inevitable lawsuits that are going to come under CEQA and NEPA for not properly studying the range of alternatives?
I'm always worried, but I'm not an attorney, so we obviously believe that we're studying an appropriate range of alternatives. This is a very expensive planning process, and we'd be foolish to do so in a way that we felt was legally vulnerable.
Final question on a different topic, and this was brought up a bit earlier about the acres on cultivated lands and habitat restoration. I noticed in the documents they say that you'll restore 45,000 acres of cultivated lands over 50 years. I wasn't entirely sure what that means. Some of it obviously would be helping certain species on existing cultivated fields like rice, like you mentioned, but how much of that 45,000 acres is farmland that you will take out of production?
Anybody?
No.
Probably better for you, but
No, yeah, none. Of this 45?
No, that stays in production.
That stays in.
The 45,000 acres would stay in production. I'm not sure if we understand the question.
You have 45,000 acres listed under your 100 and whatever it is, 140,000, 150,000
right.
acres of restoration. 45,000 acres of that is listed as cultivated lands. So what does that mean?
It means in addition to restoring those other acreages, we will preserve 45,000 acres of cultivated lands as part of our commitment to BDCP.
So you'll buy conservation easements over farmland and leave it in production?
Correct.
How does that help wildlife?
There again, it goes to agricultural stewardship. It's a concept that is being tested as far as ecosystem services and the ability to recognize multiple benefits from well-managed working landscapes. So there are opportunities. Rice is the most local example that we can point to where we have very productive ag land that is producing a crop, but it's also producing habitat for birds specifically. I'll use as the example here. There are examples of that have been piloted and are being tested in other crops throughout the state, and that's where we see the real opportunity for agricultural stewardship to be part of the solution.
Okay, and I may be missing this, but other than rice, I can't really think of many large-scale ag operations that provide real wildlife habitat.
We have, yeah, and we do have other examples. They are smaller scale. They're not like an industry-wide example, and sometimes they're very specific to what is operating around the margin of that land. So it's a very integrated approach, and I do believe there are opportunities here, and there's much more scientific interest in being able to prove this.
But other than rice, can you name another one?
Pasture.
Pasture, so range.
Corn, alfalfa. My presumption, I'm not an expert on this area of the plan, but I presume that we would have requirements for what types of crops would be grown as a part of those easements.
The other thing is just the diversity of the species we're talking about. You can be very site specific because of the species. If you identify the species and what the need of the species are, you can suit the practices to help enhance that habitat.
And Paul, to ask to answer how that helps wildlife, taking Secretary Ross's on-point description, a conservation easement then becomes the legal mechanism to memorialize those best business practices in perpetuity for the benefit of the species. And that's the content that's the exchange for the easement. And that happens all the time in the conservation world.
Yeah, I get that part. I guess I'm just not seeing, other than rice, when you have a monoculture crop and you're dumping pesticides and fertilizers on it, how that provides real wildlife habitat. But I eagerly wait more details and more chapters so I can learn how.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm showing no further questions on the phone.
Thanks, everyone. All right. Well, thank you all very much.